The rancher untied her. Anyway, after she begged, "Please, don't untie me," then he froze in place. The wind came first, cold and sharp across the prairie, carrying dust and the smell of rain that never fell. Sarah Whitfield knelt in the dirt behind the old grain shed, her wrists raw and bleeding where the rope had cut into her skin for 3 days straight. 3 days since the men who called themselves her husband's business partners had taken her from the wagon, tied her hands, and left her there like she was nothing more than cargo to be collected. Her dress, once a soft blue cotton her mother had sewn before she passed, was torn at the shoulder and stained with dirt and dried blood. She had stopped crying somewhere around the second night, when she realized no one was coming. Her husband Daniel had borrowed money from the wrong men. When he couldn't pay, they didn't come for him. They came for her, the only thing of value he had left, and they meant to sell her debt to someone else, somewhere far from anyone who knew her name. Sarah didn't know where she was anymore. She only knew the ground was cold, her stomach ached from hunger, and her hope had thinned down to almost nothing. If a story like this is already pulling at your heart, take a moment and subscribe. Because what happens next to Sarah is the kind of moment that stays with you long after the video ends. She heard hooves before she saw him, a single horse, slow and steady, moving through the brush like the rider wasn't in any hurry, like he belonged to this land, and the land trusted him back. Sarah pressed herself against the rough wood of the shed, trying to disappear into the shadow, praying it wasn't one of the men coming back to check on her. But when the horse stopped and a tall figure swung down from the saddle, she saw the line of his shoulders, the worn leather vest, the quiet way he moved, like a man who had learned long ago that loud things got you killed and silence kept you alive. He saw her before she could hide. His eyes, the color of weathered oak, found her in the shadow, and something in his face changed. Not shock, not pity exactly. Something steadier than that. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who had seen suffering before and knew exactly what to do with it. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel, smoothed by years of wind. "I'm not going to hurt you." Sarah's whole body trembled. She tried to speak, but her throat had gone dry from disuse, from 3 days of swallowing fear instead of words. The man, whose name she would later learn was Caleb Hayes, knelt down slow in front of her, the way you'd approach a wounded animal that might still have enough fight left to bite. "Who did this to you?" he asked. She shook her head, unable to answer, unable to trust that this wasn't some new trick, some new cruelty wearing a gentle face. Caleb didn't push. He simply reached into his boot and pulled out a small folding knife, moving so slowly that she had time to see every inch of the blade catching the gray afternoon light. He didn't grab her wrists. He waited, letting her see his hands, letting her decide if she would offer them to him. After a long moment, shaking, she did. The rope had dug so deep into her skin that the knife work took patience, careful patience. Caleb cutting one strand at a time so he wouldn't nick her raw flesh. When the last fiber finally gave way and her hands fell free, Sarah let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite relief, something in between, something that had been trapped in her chest for 3 long days. Caleb wrapped the rope's remains in his fist and threw it aside like it had personally offended him. Then, gentle as anything, he took her wrists in his rough, calloused hands and turned them over, examining the damage in silence. His jaw tightened. Sarah watched him swallow down whatever anger was rising in him, watched him push it aside, because right now, this moment wasn't about his anger. It was about her. "You're safe now," he whispered. 3 words. That was all. But something about the way he said them, steady and sure, like a promise carved into stone, made Sarah believe them in a way she hadn't believed anything in days. He helped her stand, though her legs nearly gave out beneath her, weak from days without proper food or water. Without asking permission, he lifted her onto his horse first, settling her in the saddle before climbing up behind her, one arm wrapped securely around her waist to keep her steady. She felt every muscle in her body tense at the closeness of a stranger. And Caleb seemed to sense it, because he kept a careful distance, even while holding her upright, his arm firm but never tight, never threatening. "My ranch is an hour's ride," he said. "I've got food, water, a bed. Nobody's going to touch you there, you have my word." Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have the strength to, and some part of her, the part that had been betrayed by her husband, sold like property by men who called themselves friends, didn't quite trust words anymore. But she leaned back, just slightly, just enough that her shoulder rested against his chest, and Caleb didn't say anything about it. He just rode on, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world to get her somewhere safe. The ranch house, when they arrived, was modest but well kept. A single-story home with a wraparound porch, a barn with fresh paint, and fields that stretched out toward the horizon, green from a wet spring. As they approached, a small voice called out from the porch, "Pa, you're back!" A boy, maybe 6 years old, came running down the porch steps, his overalls too big for his small frame, his hair a mess of brown curls. He stopped short when he saw Sarah in the saddle, his eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. "Who's that?" the boy asked. "This is Sarah. Caleb said, swinging down from the horse and reaching up to help her dismount carefully, mindful of her wrists, her weakness, her trembling legs. She's going to be staying with us a while, Tommy. She needs rest. Tommy studied Sarah with the unfiltered honesty only children possess. Did somebody hurt her? Somebody did, Caleb said quietly. But not anymore. Sarah felt tears welling up again, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Being seen, being protected, mattering to someone, even strangers, even a man who had no reason to stop his horse for a woman hiding behind a grain shed. Inside, Caleb's late wife's sister, an older woman named Ruth, who helped care for Tommy, drew a warm bath and found clean clothes for Sarah to wear. While Sarah soaked away 3 days of dirt and fear, Ruth gently tended to the rope wounds on her wrists, applying a salve that stung but soothed at the same time. You don't have to talk about it, Ruth said softly. Not until you're ready. But you're under Caleb's roof now, and that man would walk through fire before he'd let harm come to someone in his care. I've known him since he was younger than Tommy is now. He's good, all the way through. Sarah wanted to believe her. Some quiet, wounded part of her was already starting to. Over the following days, Sarah's strength slowly returned. She ate the simple meals Ruth prepared, slept in a small guest room with a quilt that smelled like cedar and lavender, and watched the ranch come alive each morning with the sounds of cattle and birdsong instead of cruel voices and rope burns. Caleb kept his distance at first, respectful, careful, never pushing her to talk, never asking more than she offered. But Sarah noticed things. She noticed how he always made sure there was extra firewood by her door before the cold nights came. She noticed how he'd quietly fixed the loose hinge on her window without being asked, just so she'd feel safer at night. She noticed how, when Tommy chattered endlessly at the dinner table, Caleb would glance her way, checking, always checking, to see if the noise was overwhelming her, if she needed quiet, if she needed anything at all. Trust, she was learning, wasn't built through grand gestures. It was built through 1,000 small ones, repeated quietly, day after day, until the fear in her chest began to loosen its grip. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after Caleb found her, Sarah sat on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and rose. Tommy ran past, chasing a barn cat, laughing the kind of laugh only children manage, full and unguarded. Caleb came to sit beside her, leaving space between them, always leaving space. You don't have to tell me, he said, but I figure you might want to talk about what happened. Sometimes carrying something alone makes it heavier. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the colors shift across the horizon. Then, slowly, the words came. She told him about Daniel, the husband who had married her for her father's land, and then gambled away everything they had, including, in the end, her safety. She told him about the men who came for her when Daniel couldn't pay, how they spoke about her like she was an object to be transferred from one owner to another. She told him about the 3 days behind the shed, the cold, the hunger, the moment she had stopped believing anyone would come. Caleb listened without interrupting, his jaw tight with quiet anger, his hands clenched against his knees. When she finished, he didn't offer empty comfort or hollow promises. He simply said, "No one is ever going to treat you that way again, not while there's breath in me." It wasn't a grand declaration of love, it was something steadier, something that mattered more. A vow from a man who didn't waste words. But peace, as it often does in this kind of life, didn't last long. Word eventually reached Daniel's old business partners that Sarah had been taken in by a rancher nearby. Men like that didn't let go of what they considered theirs to collect, even a person, even a debt paid in human suffering. One night, nearly a month after Sarah's arrival, 2 riders came up the long road to Caleb's ranch, their intentions clear in the way they sat their horses, hands resting too casually near their holsters. Caleb met them at the gate, Tommy hidden safely inside with Ruth, Sarah watching from the window with her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "We're here for what's owed," one of the men called out. "The woman comes with us, or we take what we're owed in other ways. Your cattle, your land, your choice." "She's not a debt to be collected," Caleb said, his voice carrying the same steady calm it always did. But underneath it, something harder now, something that hadn't existed in him until the day he found Sarah behind that shed. "She's under my protection. You want to test what that means? You're welcome to try." The standoff stretched on, tense and silent, until one of the men reached for his gun. What happened next happened fast, the kind of fast that only comes from a man who has spent his life protecting what matters to him. Caleb moved before the man's hand cleared his holster, disarming him with the kind of practiced ease that spoke of old battles, old wars he rarely discussed. The second man, seeing his partner on the ground and Caleb's gun steady and unwavering, decided the debt wasn't worth dying for. They rode off into the dusk, and they never came back. Inside the house, Sarah had watched the entire exchange through the window, her hands pressed against the glass, her heart breaking and mending all at once. When Caleb finally walked back inside, dust on his boots and quiet exhaustion in his eyes, Sarah crossed the room without thinking and wrapped her arms around him, something she hadn't done with another person, since before everything fell apart. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered against his chest. "You could have just let them take me. It would have been easier for you." Caleb pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Easier isn't the same as right. And nothing about you is a burden, Sarah. Not to me, not ever." Something shifted between them in that moment, something that had been quietly growing since the day he cut the rope from her wrists. Sarah looked up at him, really looked, and saw not just the protector, not just the quiet rancher who had taken in a broken stranger, but a man who had somehow, slowly become home. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Scared that even here I wasn't really safe, that somewhere deep down I'd always just be something for men to fight over or throw away." "You're not something to be thrown away," Caleb said softly. "You're someone worth standing for." "I should have told you that sooner." Tears slipped down Sarah's cheeks, but for the first time since the nightmare began, they were tears of healing instead of fear. Caleb reached up and brushed one away with his thumb, his touch gentle as the first warmth of spring after a long, brutal winter. "I don't know how to be brave again," she whispered. "You already are," he said. "You survived. You're standing here. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." In the weeks that followed, something quiet and beautiful continued to bloom between them. Tommy began calling Sarah by a name that made her heart swell every single time she heard it. "Not Miss Sarah, just Mama," said so naturally one evening at dinner that even Tommy seemed surprised by his own words, glancing up nervously to see if it was allowed. Sarah's eyes filled instantly and she nodded, unable to speak, and Tommy grinned and went back to his supper like nothing extraordinary had happened at all, though for Sarah everything had changed. On a clear autumn morning, beneath the wide open sky that had once witnessed her darkest days, Caleb stood with Sarah near the old grain shed, the very place where their story had begun. He had asked her to walk there with him, and though she hadn't understood why at first, she understood now, watching him kneel in the same dirt where he had once cut the rope from her wrists. "But this is where I found you broken," he said. "I want it to also be where I ask you to stay. Not because you need saving anymore, you've already saved yourself, but because I don't want to spend another day without you beside me." Sarah said yes before he even finished the question, her answer wrapped in tears and laughter and a happiness she had once believed she would never feel again. They married that winter in a small ceremony on the ranch, surrounded by Ruth, by neighbors who had grown fond of the quiet woman with the gentle smile, and by Tommy, who insisted on holding Sarah's hand the entire walk down the aisle because, as he proudly announced to everyone, that was his job now as her son. Years later, when Sarah would sit on that same porch watching her own children play in the yard alongside Tommy, now grown taller and steadier each season, she would sometimes think back to the cold dirt behind that shed, to the rope that had cut so deep, to the moment she had nearly given up hope entirely. And she would look at Caleb, weathered and strong and still quietly devoted after all these years, and she would understand that sometimes the darkest moments of our lives are simply the place where our real story begins. If this story touched your heart even a little, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell me what part of Sarah and Caleb's journey stayed with you most. Don't forget to subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories of broken hearts finding healing, of quiet strength, and of love that arrives exactly when it's needed most.